She didn't know anyone was listening. That's the part that gets me every time I think about this story. She wasn't performing. She wasn't fishing for sympathy. She was just a tired woman saying a true and ugly thing to her sister in a booth that smelled like fryer oil and burnt coffee, and she thought the world had gone quiet enough around her to say it. It hadn't. Someone was 3 feet away with his back to her, and what he did in the next 10 seconds is the reason her whole life bent in a different direction. Let me tell you about Jasmine Reed and the worst Tuesday of her year, and the man who cleared his throat instead of walking away. Jasmine was 33 years old and she had exactly $61 to last her until Friday. Not $61 to last the month. $61 to last 4 days, and 2 of those days her daughter had a field trip that cost $12 a head and she had 2 kids. She lived in a rented duplex on the west side of Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of street where every other porch light was burned out and nobody bothered replacing them because the landlord didn't care and the tenants had bigger problems. Her daughter, Nia, was 8, sharp as a tack, quiet in the particular way kids get when they've learned that quiet keeps the peace. Her son Malik was 5 and he still believed with his whole chest that his mother could fix anything, which was the single heaviest thing in Jasmine's life some days. Heavier than the eviction notice, heavier than the calls from collections. She'd been a paralegal for 7 years at a firm downtown Latham and Cross, doing contract review and discovery work, good at it, the kind of good where partners started routing things to her desk without being asked. Then Latham and Cross merged with a bigger firm out of Raleigh, and the bigger firm already had its own paralegals, and one Friday afternoon 11 months ago, Jasmine was called into a conference room with 4 other people and told, in language so soft it took a full minute to understand what was actually happening, that her position had been absorbed into the new structure. She walked out with a cardboard box and a severance check that lasted exactly 9 weeks. Since then she'd sent out 106 applications. She kept a running count on a sticky note stuck to the inside of her kitchen cabinet, because if she didn't count it somewhere concrete, the number would just live in her chest and crush something. 106 applications. 9 interviews. 0 offers. The gap on her resume had grown from awkward to alarming, and every hiring manager who called back wanted to know why a woman with 7 years of solid legal experience had spent almost a year doing nothing, and Jasmine had learned that the merger eliminated my position sounded, somehow, like an admission of guilt no matter how she phrased it. She was working 2 jobs to keep from drowning. Mornings she cleaned offices for a commercial janitorial company, 5 buildings on rotation, vacuuming carpets that other people would walk across without ever knowing her name. Evenings, 3 nights a week, she worked the register at a beauty supply store on Freedom Drive, where the owner, a man named Curtis, called her baby girl, in a tone that made her skin crawl a little every single time, and she smiled through it because baby girl paid $9 an hour and she needed every one of them. Her ex-husband, Trayvon, had been gone for 2 years. Not dramatically gone. Not a fight, not a scene. He just slowly stopped being present the way water slowly stops being in a glass you forgot on the counter, until one day you look and it's just gone and you can't remember the exact moment it evaporated. He paid child support when he remembered, which was roughly every 3rd month, and he had a new girlfriend named Brianna who posted vacation photos that Jasmine had made the mistake of looking at exactly once and then never again. That Tuesday morning had started with the girls fighting over the last good hair tie, which escalated into Malik crying because Nia said something true and mean about his shoes having a hole in them, which escalated into Jasmine standing in her kitchen at 6:40 in the morning with her forehead against the refrigerator door, breathing through her nose, counting to 10, because if she raised her voice one more time this week she was afraid of what would come out of her. She got a text at 7:15. Past due notice. Second and final. If payment of $1,140 is not received by the 5th of next month, eviction proceedings will begin. She read it standing in her work uniform for the janitorial company, holding a mug of instant coffee she'd made with water boiled in a saucepan because the coffee maker had died 3 weeks ago and $40 might as well have been $4,000. She did not tell her mother about the notice. Her mother, Odessa, lived across town in a small brick house she'd owned outright for 20 years. The kind of woman who cooked like she was feeding a church potluck every single Sunday whether anyone was coming or not, and who had called Jasmine every week since the divorce to ask how the girls were doing and whether Jasmine was eating and whether she'd been on any dates yet, God help her. Odessa had called on Thursday and said, "Bring the babies Sunday. I made a pot roast the size of a Buick. Bring yourself too. You sound thin on the phone." Jasmine had said she wasn't thin, she was fine, and Odessa had said, "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you sound thin." And that had been the end of the argument, because you did not win arguments with Odessa Reed, you just eventually agreed with her out loud while privately deciding whatever you wanted. So on Sunday, Jasmine loaded her 2 children onto a city bus with a transfer, because her car had a check engine light she was too scared to have looked at, and rode 40 minutes across town to her mother's house, and ate pot roast, and let her mother look at her the whole meal with the particular expression of a woman who knew something was wrong and was deciding how long to let her daughter pretend otherwise. After the meal, after the kids disappeared into the back bedroom where Odessa kept a chest of old toys and a television that only got 4 channels, Odessa sat Jasmine down at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and folded her hands and waited. This was Odessa's particular gift. She could outwait anybody. Jasmine lasted about a minute and a half before it all came pouring out of her like something that had been building pressure for months. The eviction notice. The $61. The 106 applications. The hole in Malik's shoe that she hadn't been able to replace yet. "I'm 2 months behind on rent," Jasmine said, and her voice cracked on the word rent in a way that embarrassed her. "I have until the 5th. That's 19 days. I've done the math 4 different ways and it doesn't work, Mama. Even with both jobs it doesn't work." Odessa didn't flinch. She reached over, took Jasmine's hand and said, "I have some put back. Not a lot. Enough to cover this. I'm not taking your savings. I didn't ask you to take it. I'm lending it. You'll pay me back when things turn around. What if things don't turn around? Then we'll figure out the next thing after that," Odessa said like it was the simplest math in the world. "1 piece at a time, baby. That's the only way anybody's ever gotten through anything. You think I built this house 1 piece at a time by knowing how the whole thing would end before I started laying brick? Ain't nobody knows that. You just keep laying brick." They argued about it for another 20 minutes, the way you argue with someone you know is going to win, and eventually Jasmine let herself be helped, because the alternative was watching her children sleep in a car. And pride does not survive contact with that particular image for very long. After lunch, after the dishes, after Malik had been allowed to help water the tomato plants in the backyard with an enthusiasm that suggested he believed himself solely responsible for their survival, they did the thing they always did on Sundays at Odessa's, which was walk 4 blocks to a diner called the Blue Plate for pie. It was a tradition older than the divorce. It had started when Nia was still in a high chair and someone discovered that cherry pie could buy 20 straight minutes of peace, and it had calcified into ritual the way these things do, unquestioned load-bearing. The Blue Plate was a real diner, red vinyl booths gone slightly gray at the seams, a chrome napkin dispenser on every table, a rotating case of pies by the register that had probably been rotating since the Carter administration. They took their usual booth by the window. The kids ordered pie, which was the entire point of the outing. Odessa ordered coffee. Jasmine ordered water, and then, because her mother gave her a look, a slice of lemon meringue she didn't particularly want and definitely couldn't afford. The booth behind them was empty when they sat down. It didn't stay empty. A man came in alone about 5 minutes later, mid to late 30s, a dark jacket over a gray Henley, the specific kind of tired that isn't about sleep, it's about carrying something. He sat in the booth directly behind Jasmine, facing the window, which meant his back was to her table the entire time. She barely registered him. He was a shape at the edge of her vision, nothing more. For a few minutes it was good. It was genuinely, completely good. Malik managed to get meringue on his own ear somehow, a physical achievement nobody could quite explain, and Nia pointed it out with the withering precision of an older sister building a permanent record. And Malik reached up, found the meringue, considered it, and announced, "That's for later," and put his hand back down, and Jasmine laughed so hard she had to put her fork down. For 1 whole minute, sitting in that booth with pie on somebody's ear and her mother across the table and her rent still unpaid and her life still on fire, Jasmine felt completely, uncomplicatedly fine. Then Odessa said, "You been on any dates?" And the minute ended. "No, Mama." You should. I'm 33, not 80. I know how old I am. You're a beautiful woman. You worked hard your whole life. You deserve somebody good. I don't have time for somebody good, Jasmine said, and something in her chest had gone tight and low, the way it did right before she said things she usually kept locked up. I don't have time, period. And even if I did, she glanced at the kids who were absorbed in a very serious negotiation over who got the last bite of pie crust, and lowered her voice out of instinct, the way you do when you're about to say something you don't want small ears to catch. Who's gonna want this, mama? I'm broke. I'm about to get evicted. I got 2 kids and a car with a check engine light I'm scared to even look at. Nobody signs up for that. Odessa opened her mouth to argue, and this is the part Jasmine would replay for years afterward, because what came out of her mouth next wasn't a thought she'd had before. It wasn't a line she'd rehearsed in her head during some bitter, sleepless night. It was just the truest, most unguarded thing sitting at the bottom of her, and it came loose because she was exhausted and the pie was there and her mother was the one person on earth she could fall apart in front of. Nobody sees single moms as wife material, she said, quiet almost to herself. Everybody acts like they will. They don't. She hadn't meant it to carry. She genuinely believed in the half-second after she said it, that it had stayed inside the small circle of the booth between her and her mother, and that the man 3 feet behind her, back turned, minding his own business, hadn't heard a word of it. She was wrong about that. Odessa's face did something complicated, not pity exactly, not anger exactly, something older than both, and she was drawing breath to say something back when the man in the booth behind them stood up. He wasn't dramatic about it. He'd clearly already been in the process of leaving. His jacket was half on, his wallet was open in his hand, a few bills already pulled loose to leave on the table. But he stopped halfway between sitting and standing, and for a second he just stood there, not turning around, not looking at any of them. Jasmine felt her stomach drop the specific way it drops when you realize you have been overheard. The booths were close. Closer than she'd registered. He'd been right there the whole time. He put the bills back in his wallet. He turned around slowly, and for one terrible second Jasmine braced for pity, for some clumsy, well-meaning comment that would somehow make everything worse. The kind of thing strangers say when they think they're being kind and are actually just making you the main character of your own humiliation. Instead, he cleared his throat and said quietly, mostly to the window rather than to any one of them directly, "My wife died 4 years ago." He paused. "She had a son from before we met. He was 7 when I married her. He's 11 now." Another pause longer. "He's mine in every way that matters." He looked out at the street for a second, not at Jasmine, not at Odessa, just out at the ordinary Sunday traffic going by. "I just thought you should know that." Then he put his jacket on the rest of the way, walked to the counter, paid for his coffee in cash, and left. The bell over the door gave one small ring behind him, and then he was gone, and the diner went on being a diner, forks against plates, somebody's radio playing low behind the counter, like nothing at all had happened. Malik looked up from his pie with the delayed awareness of a 5-year-old registering that something had occurred. "Who was that?" "A person," Odessa said, and there was something in her voice she was clearly working to keep smoothed over. "What did he say?" "Something important," Odessa said, and looked at Jasmine. Jasmine was looking at the door. She would think about him on the bus ride home. She would think about him while she read Malik his bedtime book about the dinosaur who didn't want to share, and while she lay awake later doing rent math in her head for the 11th time that week. She didn't know his name. She'd barely seen his face, a half-turn, a jacket, tired eyes, gone before she could really look. She knew only that his wife had died, that he had a son who wasn't his by blood and was his in every way that mattered, and that he'd stood up in a diner for a stranger who owed him nothing, and said the one sentence she hadn't known she needed to hear, and then left before she could even say thank you. It wasn't a love story. She was too tired and too practical to make it one, not in that moment. It was just a splinter. A small warm coal she carried around in her chest for the rest of that week without quite understanding why it wouldn't go out. On Thursday she had an interview. It was for a paralegal and compliance support position at a company called Whitfield Logistics Group, a mid-sized freight and warehousing company with offices downtown in one of the glass towers on Tryon Street. It wasn't her dream job. It was, more importantly, a job, Full benefits, a real salary, something that would not only stop the eviction cold but might actually let her exhale for the first time in almost a year. She'd applied to it 4 months earlier and heard nothing, filed it mentally under the long list of applications that had gone silent. Then out of nowhere an email had come from someone named Patricia Alvarez, HR coordinator, asking if she was still interested and available. Jasmine had responded in under 2 minutes. She wore her interview suit, the one that still fit if she didn't take a full breath in it, which she'd decided to interpret as a sign that her life was difficult and not catastrophic. The lobby of the building had a coffee cart she wanted badly and did not buy from, because spending $4 before a job interview felt like daring the universe to take the job away from her out of spite. Patricia Alvarez was warm and efficient, walked her through the role, confirmed the salary range in a number that made Jasmine's pulse do something complicated, and then said, "You'll also meet briefly with the department head. He likes to sit in on final candidates. Nothing to be nervous about." "Of course," Jasmine said and felt her heart rate climb anyway. She sat in the waiting area for 9 minutes. Then a door opened and the man from the diner walked out. He looked different in the light. That was her first thought, and it was not, in the moment, a particularly useful one to be having. Mid to late 30s. Reading glasses pushed up on his head that he took off and folded as he walked, a gesture that made him look briefly, unexpectedly human. A folder under one arm. He stopped walking the second he saw her. She stopped too. For what felt like a very long time neither of them said anything. "You're the 3 o'clock, he said finally. It wasn't really a question. "I take it you're the department head," Jasmine said. "Grant Whitfield." He didn't offer his hand right away. He was still looking at her like he was working something out. "You were at the Blue Plate. Sunday." "Yes." "With your mother. And 2 kids." "Yes." He seemed to arrive somewhere internally, some decision he made and then simply moved past. "Come in," he said and held the door. His office was orderly without being sterile. A framed photograph on the desk angled just slightly away from visitors. A plant in the corner someone had clearly overwatered out of love rather than skill, folders stacked in towers that made sense only to the person who'd built them. He sat. She sat. He opened her resume. 7 years at Latham and Cross, he said. Merger eliminated the position. "Yes. I know Latham and Cross. Good shop before the merger." He read further. "Your paralegal certification's current. I renewed it in the spring even while I was out of work. Didn't want it lapsing." He looked up at that, something registering behind his eyes, and asked her a version of the question every interview asks. "Tell me about a time you caught a problem before it became one." And she told him, calm and specific, about a vendor contract discrepancy she'd flagged at Latham and Cross that had turned into a quiet 6-figure correction nobody outside 3 people ever heard about. He listened the way people listen when they actually want the answer, not when they're just waiting for their turn to talk again. At the end he closed the folder and told her they'd be in touch by the end of the week. She stood, thanked him, and was almost to the door when he said without looking up, "For what it's worth. You were wrong. What you said in the diner." She turned around. "You heard all of that." "I wasn't trying to." He met her eyes. "But yes." She held his gaze a beat. "Maybe," she said and walked out because she genuinely did not know what else to say to that, and because saying anything more felt like standing too close to a fire she couldn't control yet. Patricia Alvarez called Friday afternoon. Jasmine was at the beauty supply store, and Curtis had just called her sweetheart twice in the same sentence while restocking edge control, and her patience for the day had roughly 4 minutes left in it when her phone lit up with an unfamiliar Charlotte number. She stepped outside onto the sidewalk to take it. "Ms. Reed, we'd like to offer you the position." Jasmine put her hand flat against the brick wall of the store and closed her eyes. Patricia kept talking. Salary, full benefits, a start date 2 Mondays out. And Jasmine heard maybe half of it through the ringing in her own ears and said, "Yes, that works," in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. She stood on that sidewalk for a full 3 minutes after the call ended. A bus went by. Somebody's radio thumped from a passing car. She texted her mother 2 words. "Got it." Odessa's reply came back in under a minute. "I know. Now go tell your babies." The first 2 weeks at Whitfield Logistics were hard in the ordinary way new things are hard. New systems, new names, new people quietly deciding who she was and how much space to give her. She was good at reading rooms. 7 years in a law firm does that to a person whether they want it or not. And within 3 days she understood the department's real architecture, who actually did the work and who managed the appearance of doing it. Grant Whitfield ran the Compliance and Contracts Division with the kind of quiet authority that expects competence and rewards it without ceremony. He wasn't warm in any performative way. He was fair, which she came to understand was a different and, in her experience, much rarer thing. He didn't treat her differently because of the diner. That was the first thing she noticed and the thing she respected most. He didn't hover. He gave her a real project in her second week and expected her to handle it, and she did. What she didn't expect, and what nobody had warned her about in the interview, was Derek Halloway. She heard about him before she met him properly, the way office knowledge always arrives. Sideways through lunchroom conversation and the specific pause people made before certain names. Derek had been at Whitfield 9 years. He considered himself, in his own words, the institutional memory of this division, and 4 months before Jasmine was hired, he had applied for the senior compliance coordinator role. The exact role that had eventually, after a search Jasmine knew nothing about at the time she applied, become the job she got. Derek introduced himself on her third day with a smile that reached exactly as far as his teeth and stopped. "Welcome aboard. Everybody's been curious about the new hire." "Hope I can be useful," Jasmine said. "Oh, I'm sure you'll do just fine," Derek said, and they both understood exactly what he meant by that, and neither of them said it out loud. 3 weeks into the job, reviewing a routine batch of vendor documentation that nobody else had bothered to look at closely in years, Jasmine found something. It was small at first. A pattern of adjustments in quarterly freight billing reconciliations, nothing that screamed on its own, but stacked across 3 separate vendor accounts over 5 quarters, always the same category of adjustment, always landing just under the dollar threshold that would trigger a mandatory second review. She sat with it for 2 days before she said anything to anyone, because she'd learned the hard way once years ago what it cost to accuse something you weren't completely sure about. When she finally brought it forward, she brought it to Grant not because she was trying to impress him, but because he was her manager and this was plainly his to know. He read through what she'd assembled twice. "How long have you been sitting on this?" 2 days formally. "I first noticed the shape of it about a week ago. I wanted to be sure I wasn't seeing a pattern that wasn't there. And now I'm fairly sure I am seeing it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Leave this with me," he said finally. "Don't discuss it with anyone else yet." She nodded and went back to her desk and told herself that would be the end of it, at least for a while. It was not the end of it. 2 hours later, Derek stopped by her desk with the specific casualness of a man who has rehearsed casual in a mirror. "Heard you've been digging around in the old vendor files." "Just getting familiar with the history," Jasmine said, keeping her face still. "Those accounts have been running clean for years. I signed off on a good number of those quarters myself back when I ran point on vendor relations." "Good to know," she said. His smile didn't move. His eyes did. "Grant's door was closed a while this afternoon," he said, like it was nothing, like it was weather. "Meetings happen, I guess." He walked off before she answered. She sat very still at her desk after he'd gone, staring at her monitor without seeing it, and understood with a cold, settling clarity that someone had already told him. What followed over the next 2 weeks was not loud. That was what made it so hard to fight. It was small and patient and deniable, the kind of thing a person could describe if confronted directly as concern rather than sabotage. There were questions phrased like questions that were really statements. "Did you clear that approach with anyone first? Just curious." There was information that arrived to her a few minutes too late to be useful. A client call she was supposed to sit in on where she'd been given the wrong conference room number and walked in 8 minutes late, looking, to everyone watching, careless. There was an email, copied to half the department, in which Derek gently corrected a filing method she'd used. A method that wasn't actually wrong, but could be made to sound questionable to anyone who hadn't looked closely. And then there was the story. She heard it the way these things always surface, third hand, softened at the edges. A version of events in which Jasmine had gone digging through old vendor files as a play for visibility, because she was new and insecure and looking to make a name for herself fast. Nobody said this to her face. That was the entire design of it. She found out the specifics from a junior analyst named Priya, who stopped by her desk on a Thursday afternoon and said quietly, glancing once toward Derek's empty office, "I just want you to know some of what's going around isn't coming from me." "What's going around?" Jasmine asked. Priya told her. Jasmine thanked her, walked to the restroom, stood at the sink and looked at her own reflection for a long moment. She thought about the eviction notice she'd already paid off with her mother's help. She thought about Curtis calling her sweetheart. She thought about 106 applications and 9 interviews and 0 offers, and about everything it had cost to finally get somewhere that felt like solid ground. She dried her hands, went back to her desk and got back to work, because quitting had never once in her entire adult life been an option she'd been able to afford. What Jasmine did over the following 3 weeks took patience she didn't know she still had left in her. She went back through 5 years of vendor filings, all of them, pulling every comparable document she could access. Industry billing standards, the company's own internal reconciliation policy, regulatory guidance on freight adjustment reporting. She built a timeline. And what she found wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was a signature. The same category of adjustment, the same timing, the same method repeating across vendor accounts that all traced back, eventually, to contracts Derek Holloway had personally reviewed and signed off on. It wasn't a massive fraud. Nobody was going to write a movie about it. But it was real, and it was systematic, and it had clearly been quietly bleeding the company for years in amounts small enough that nobody had ever bothered to look twice. She did not take it to Grant first this time. She made a full copy of everything and kept it at her apartment in a manila folder tucked inside a drawer under her bed, because some old instinct told her that documentation that only existed in one place, inside the building where the person it implicated still worked, was documentation that could disappear. Then she requested a meeting with the company's compliance officer, a sharp, quiet woman named Renata Cole who had been with Whitfield for 11 years and had the specific bearing of someone who had survived a great deal of internal politics without ever needing to bury a single body herself. Jasmine laid it all out, the pattern, the timeline, the source documents. "I understand this may be uncomfortable given who's involved," Jasmine said. "I'm bringing it forward anyway because it's accurate and because it's the right thing to do." Renata studied the documentation for a long time without speaking. "How long have you been here?" 9 weeks. "And you found this in 9 weeks?" It wasn't quite a question. "I was reviewing historical files to get familiar with the accounts. I found a pattern. I could have let it go. I didn't think that was right." Renata looked at her for a moment with an expression Jasmine couldn't fully place. "Leave this with me," she said finally. "I have copies," Jasmine said. "Good," Renata said. "Keep them." Nothing happened for 11 days. Jasmine went to work every morning not knowing whether that day would be the one where the ground opened up under her instead of Derek, because that was the particular cruelty of workplace politics. The person telling the truth is never entirely safe just because they're right. Malik got a cold that kept him up 2 nights running, and Jasmine went to work on 4 hours of sleep both mornings and smiled through client calls and felt, more than once, like she was holding her whole life together with tape that had already been reused too many times. And then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Derek Holloway was not at his desk. His computer was gone. His chair had been pushed in with the specific, careful finality of furniture that isn't coming back. Nobody said a word about it out loud, but by 10 o'clock the whole floor had the electric hum of a place where something significant had happened and hadn't yet been formally announced. At 11:40, Grant called Jasmine into his office. She sat down. He looked tired in a different way than she'd seen from him before, the kind of tired that comes from a genuinely hard week rather than a general condition of living. "The compliance review is finished," he said. "What you flagged holds up completely. There'll be some regulatory reporting required, some internal process changes." He paused. "Derek's employment here has ended." She didn't say anything right away. "I want to say something to you directly," Grant said, and he seemed to be choosing the words carefully as he went. "What you did, bringing that forward the way you did, fully, without trying to manage the politics of it while there were clearly pressures working against you the whole time. That's exactly the kind of work this department needs more of. And the fact that it cost you something to do it makes it matter more, not less. I was just doing my job, Jasmine said. You were doing your job while somebody was actively trying to make you look unstable in your first 2 months here, Grant said. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't want you walking out of this office thinking they are. She looked down at her hands for a moment. I've been undermined before, she said quietly. At jobs that mattered a lot less than this one. He nodded slowly, and there was a beat of silence in the room that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but was full of something neither of them named yet. How are your kids? He asked, and it came out simply, without any performance in it, the way you ask a question you actually want answered. Nia's good. 8, and she has extremely strong opinions about everything on this earth. Malik's 5. He's currently in a phase where he names every dinosaur toy after somebody from church. Something moved at the corner of Grant's mouth. My son went through something like that with cars. Every single one had a name for almost 2 years. How old is he now? 11. Plays travel hockey. He's got opinions about everything too, in that specific 11-year-old boy way where he's completely certain he's right about things he is 100% wrong about. Jasmine laughed, a real one, not the polite kind she'd trained herself into over the past year. Grant looked at her for a second like the sound had genuinely surprised him. I should let you get back to it, he said, though something about the way he said it suggested he wasn't in a hurry for her to leave. She stood up. Grant. It was the first time she'd used his first name in that office. Thank you. For the opportunity. And for, she stopped, then finished it because he'd been honest with her in a diner and in this office when he had no reason to be. For taking me seriously from the start. That part was easy, he said. You made it easy. That night Trayvon called. This wasn't unusual. He called in waves, usually when guilt caught up with him or something reminded him he had children. Heard you got a new job. Congratulations, he said. Thanks, Jasmine said, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, stirring dinner with spices she'd finally been able to afford to replace. I wanted to talk about the summer, he went on. Brianna and I are thinking about taking a trip down to Myrtle Beach in June. I was wondering if the kids could come along. Jasmine set the spoon down very carefully on the counter. For a week. Yeah. They'd love it, the beach, the pool, all that. Trayvon. When's the last time you actually saw them? Oz. Easter. It's May. You haven't seen them since Easter. You haven't sent March or April's support. And now you want to take them on a beach trip. I told you about my cash flow. Your cash flow's fine. You posted a picture from a steakhouse 2 weeks ago. That was a work thing. I'm not doing this, she said, not loud, just final. When you want to actually see them, local, consistent, something they can count on, you call me. When March and April show up, you call me. I'm not negotiating a beach vacation over the phone while I'm making dinner. She hung up. Nia appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later. Was that Dad? Yeah. Nia looked at her mother's face and had the wisdom, even at 8, not to ask anything else. She just came and stood next to her at the stove and looked into the pan. Is that chicken? Yeah. Smells good. Can I stir it? Yeah, baby, Jasmine said and handed her the spoon. She did not expect anything to happen with Grant. That's the honest truth of it. She wasn't building toward anything the day she agreed to grab coffee with him 3 weeks later. It started, if she was being precise about it, over an email about a supplier contract that somehow, over 4 exchanges, stopped being about the contract at all. He mentioned his son Eli had a hockey tournament that Saturday. Did she know anything about hockey? She did not know a single thing about hockey. He sent her a paragraph explaining icing that was clearly written for someone who had never seen a puck in her life. And she sent back 3 specific follow-up questions designed to make it sound like she found the sport genuinely fascinating, which she absolutely did not. He called her instead of emailing the answers. They talked for almost an hour. He was folding laundry the whole time. She could hear the specific rhythm of it in the pauses. She sat on her own couch, laundry she'd been meaning to fold forgotten in a basket at her feet, and realized somewhere in the middle of the call that she had forgotten this was a thing that could still be easy. Just talking to somebody. They got coffee the following week. Then dinner without the kids, which required a small logistical operation involving Odessa and a lot of calendar juggling, at a restaurant neither of them had been to before, which felt, without either of them saying so, like neutral ground. She told him about the layoff, the 106 applications, the eviction notice, the 2 jobs, Curtis and his cologne and his sweetheart. She told it matter-of-factly, the way you tell things once you're far enough past the worst of them that the telling doesn't swallow you back up. He told her about his wife. Her name had been Claire. They'd met at a mutual friend's wedding when Eli's biological father was already long gone from the picture, and Grant had loved that little boy from almost the first week, before he'd even fully worked out what he felt for Claire herself. They'd been married 5 years. Claire had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer when Eli was 9. She died 2 years later. He remembers her, Grant said. That's the thing I'm most grateful for out of all of it. He was old enough. He has real memories, not just photographs someone else has to explain to him. I'm glad, Jasmine said. The first year was... He stopped, considered. I don't have a good word for the first year. You don't need one, she said. He looked at her across the table for a second. No, he agreed. I guess I don't. They talked for almost 3 hours. She got home before the kids, who were at Odessa's for the night, and stood in her quiet kitchen afterward feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. Not hope exactly. Something closer to the possibility of hope. The recognition that a door she'd assumed was permanently shut had, in fact, simply been closed, and closed doors could open again. The complication, when it came, arrived from a direction Jasmine hadn't expected. It came from Nia. Nia was 8 and watchful in a way that sometimes unsettled Jasmine, the way children who've had to grow up a little faster than they should notice things that aren't obvious to anyone else. She'd clocked something in the way her mother said Grant's name. Nothing overt, nothing you could point to, just a shift in tone a girl who'd spent 8 years studying her mother's face would catch and nobody else would. She brought it up on a Wednesday evening over a fractions worksheet Jasmine was checking. Is Grant your boyfriend? Jasmine looked up. No. He's my manager. He's a friend. Wait, Nia said. Would it be bad if he was? Jasmine set the worksheet down. What do you mean? Like, would that be bad for us? Nia chewed the end of her pencil, a habit Jasmine had corrected roughly 900 times without success. Jasmine looked at her daughter for a long moment. 8 years old. The person who had kept her moving through the worst year of her life just by needing breakfast and homework help and somebody to check her spelling words. That's a real question, Jasmine said. And I want to give you a real answer. Nia waited. It wouldn't be bad for us. Not ever. Nothing I do changes that you and Malik are the most important thing in my whole world. That doesn't move. It might change some things though. Things change already, Nia said. Things kept changing this whole year and we kept being okay. Jasmine studied her daughter. Are you asking because you're worried or because you wanted me to know you noticed? Nia thought about it with real seriousness. Both. Fair enough, Jasmine said and picked the worksheet back up. He seems nice from what you've said, Nia offered a minute later. He is. He's a good person. Does he have kids? A son. 11. Older than you. Nia considered this. Does his son like hockey? He plays it. I think hockey's kind of violent. It can be. Wait, Nia said. I might watch it sometime. Hypothetically. Jasmine kept her face carefully neutral. Hypothetically, she agreed. There is a particular thing that happens to people who have carried real weight alone for a long stretch of time. They start to treat asking for anything as a kind of danger. They start to believe that needing someone even a little, even for something small, is the first domino in a line that ends in everything collapsing because in their experience eventually everything does. Jasmine had learned this lesson from a husband who had seemed solid and turned out to be conditional. She'd learned it from a firm that had folded her position without warning. She'd learned it from a year of the world politely, firmly declining to make room for her. So when things with Grant began to feel like more than a careful friendship, When the dinners got easier and the calls got longer and her children began asking increasingly specific hypothetical questions about hockey and what an 11-year-old boy might think of pepperoni versus plain cheese, Jasmine did the thing she knew best. She pulled back. Not entirely. Just enough. She was careful at work. Appropriate. She didn't let anything be visible that she hadn't consciously decided to let be visible. Grant noticed, of course he noticed. He asked her about it on a Thursday when they were the last two people left on the floor and she was gathering her things to leave. Can I ask you something? Sure. Did I do something? She stopped halfway through zipping her bag. No. Because it feels like something changed. She was quiet a moment. Nothing changed, she said, and then because that wasn't honest, I'm just not good at this. At it being easy. When something's easy it makes me nervous because the last time something was easy, it stopped being easy real fast. I understand that better than you'd think, he said. I went 2 years without buying a new couch after Claire died. Because buying a couch felt like agreeing this was permanent, that this was just what my life was now. I couldn't do it. She almost smiled despite herself. A couch. A couch, he confirmed. Ridiculous, I know. What did you sit on for 2 years? The old one. It was fine. I just wouldn't let myself replace it. Did you ever replace it? Eli's hockey bag finally forced the issue. The smell became a genuine health hazard. She laughed and he watched her do it like he'd been hoping for exactly that. He didn't push past that moment. He didn't try to define anything or extract a promise. He just stood there, jacket over one arm, keys in his hand, and let her figure out on her own what she needed to say. I don't know how to do this when there's so much that could go wrong, she said finally. There's a lot that could go wrong, he agreed. There's also a lot that could be good. Those are the same situation. Yes, he said. They are. The kids are part of it, she started. That was never a question, he said. That was never something you needed to convince me of. She looked at him a long moment. Give me some time. You have it, he said. Take whatever you need. She walked out, reached the elevator, pressed the button. When it arrived, she didn't get on. She stood there a second and then turned around. He was still standing where she'd left him, watching her go with an expression carefully trying not to be anything at all. She walked back. Stopped a few feet from him. I said I needed time. You did. I still do. But I don't want you thinking that means I don't already know. Know what? That this is something. That you're a good person, she said. And that this could be a good thing. Simple as that, he said. Okay, she said and went home, and this time she meant it as a beginning rather than a retreat. For a while things went well enough that Jasmine allowed herself cautiously to believe the worst year of her life might actually be behind her. She caught up on rent with room to spare. She replaced Malik's shoes, both pairs, and bought a coffee maker without checking the price tag more than twice. Nia's grades climbed. Odessa stopped asking every single call whether Jasmine was eating. Grant and Eli came to a Sunday dinner at Jasmine's apartment, an event that Odessa insisted on attending as an unofficial chaperone, and Malik decided within roughly 4 minutes that Eli was, in Malik's exact words, cool for an old kid. And Nia watched the whole thing with her arms crossed and her verdict withheld, which everyone who knew Nia understood was actually a promising sign. And then 6 weeks after Derek Holloway's chair had been pushed in for the last time, everything came apart at once, faster and worse than any of it had built. It started with an email. Jasmine came in on a Monday morning to find a message waiting in her inbox from Renata Cole. Subject line: Please see me before you start anything else today. Jasmine's stomach dropped before she'd even opened it. She'd learned over the past year to trust that particular drop. Renata's office door was closed when Jasmine got there, which it never was. Renata gestured her in and closed it fully behind her, which she also never did. I need to ask you something directly, Renata said, and I need you to answer directly. Okay. Did you access the Meridian Freight vendor file last Thursday evening after 6 p.m.? Jasmine felt something cold settle into her chest. No. I left at 5:30 last Thursday. I picked my son up from his after-school program. There's a system log showing your credentials accessing that file at 6:41 p.m. That's not possible. I wasn't in the building. Renata slid a printed access log across the desk. Jasmine's employee ID time-stamped 6:41 p.m., accessing a vendor file she'd never once touched, a vendor she'd never worked with on an account that, she felt her stomach turn over as she read further, showed a fund transfer flagged for review the very next morning. $22,000, routed through a Shell intermediary account, initiated using her login. I didn't do this, Jasmine said, and heard her own voice come out too fast, too high, the exact register of someone who sounds guilty even when she isn't, which she knew because she'd sounded that way once before in her life, the day she'd been let go from Latham and Cross and tried to explain to a room of strangers that none of it was her fault. Renata, I promise you I was not in this building at 6:41 on Thursday. My son's teacher can confirm I was at pickup. There's a sign-out sheet at the after-school program with my signature on it at 6:15. Renata studied her for a long moment, and Jasmine couldn't read a single thing behind her expression. I believe you're telling me what you believe, Renata said carefully. But I have a system log with your credentials on a flagged transaction the same week we just terminated an employee for a pattern very much like this one. You understand how this looks? I understand exactly how this looks, Jasmine said, and felt something rise in her that was equal parts fear and fury. It looks like somebody used my login. Which means somebody either had my password or somebody with system access spoofed my credentials, and either way that is not the same thing as me doing this. I'm not accusing you, Renata said. I'm required to investigate. You understand that means you'll need to be walked through this formally, and until it's resolved, I need you to hand over your access badge and step back from active files. You're suspending me. I'm following protocol, Renata said, and for the first time something like genuine regret moved across her face. I don't have a choice here, Jasmine. I wish I did. Jasmine sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she could make herself drive anywhere. She called her mother first because that was who she called when the ground gave out, and Odessa said in the flattest, calmest voice Jasmine had ever heard her use, "Somebody's trying to bury you. You did not do this." I know I didn't do it, Jasmine said. That's not the problem. The problem is proving it. She thought, sitting there with her hands still on the wheel, about how fast a good life could be pulled back out from under a person. For months ago she'd had $61 and an eviction notice. 2 months ago she'd had a job, a paycheck, a man who looked at her like she mattered. Now she had a suspension, a fraud accusation with her name stamped on it, and a co-worker who had already been fired once for exactly this kind of thing standing somewhere in the background of her mind like a shadow she couldn't quite place yet. She called Grant from the parking garage. He answered on the first ring. I need you to hear something from me before you hear it from anyone else, she said, and told him everything. The access log, the timestamp, the flagged transfer, the suspension. There was a silence on the line long enough that her stomach dropped a second time, this time for a different reason. Grant. I'm here, he said. I'm thinking. Another pause. You were at pickup at 6:15. Sign-out sheet, my signature, the after-school coordinator will confirm it in about 4 seconds if anyone asks her. Then this is provable, he said, and his voice had shifted into something harder and more focused than she'd heard from him before. The voice, she realized, of a man who ran a company and had decided he was not going to let something slide past him twice. Jasmine, I need you to not panic and I need you to not talk to anyone else about this today. Can you do that? I'm trying, she said, and her voice cracked on the second word in a way she hated. I believe you, he said. Completely. I need you to hold on to that part while the rest of it gets sorted out. That night, alone in her apartment after the kids were asleep, she sat at her kitchen table with the manila folder from months earlier still tucked in a drawer under her bed, and something clicked into place that made her blood run cold. She pulled the folder out, spread the old timeline across the table and looked at the dates again, slower this time. The pattern she'd found, Derek's pattern, the one that got him fired, hadn't fully stopped the week he left. It had stopped on paper. But the Shell intermediary account flagged on the new transfer had a routing structure that looked, to her practiced eye, almost identical to the ones she'd traced 5 years back. Somebody had kept the account active. Somebody who knew exactly how the old scheme worked because they'd either built it or watched it get built, and who had a very specific reason to want Jasmine discredited fast, before anyone looked too closely at whether the old scheme had actually fully stopped. She thought about who else had access to the old vendor files. Who else had worked closely enough with Derek to know the shape of what he'd done, and who had motive to make sure the person who'd caught it once didn't get the chance to catch it again. She thought of Priya, who had warned her once, quietly at real risk to herself. She thought of the junior staff who'd been around Derek's desk the longest. And she thought with a slow, sick certainty of one name in particular. A name belonging to someone who had been suspiciously quiet, suspiciously supportive in the weeks since Derek's firing. Someone who had access to her badge number because he'd covered her desk once during a systems migration. Someone who had, she now remembered with a jolt that made her hands go cold, asked her once, almost in passing, what days she usually picked her son up. Marcus Feld. A contracts associate 2 desks down, quiet, unassuming, the kind of coworker you'd never think twice about, who had been close with Derek in a way nobody had ever bothered mentioning because nobody had thought it mattered. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table until nearly 2 a.m, rebuilding the timeline with everything she had, cross-referencing badge logs from the systems migration months back against the new transfer routing, building, piece by piece, brick by brick, exactly the kind of proof that could not be waved away as a misunderstanding. The next morning, badge confiscated, technically suspended, she did the one thing she was still allowed to do. She called Renata Cole and asked for a meeting off the books before the formal investigation proceeded any further, and she brought the timeline with her, laid it out across Renata's desk with hands that were shaking slightly despite every effort not to let them. I want you to look at the routing structure on this new flagged account, Jasmine said, and then I want you to look at the structure on the accounts I flagged 5 months ago. And then I want you to pull badge and system logs for Marcus Feld for the week of the systems migration, when he covered my desk and had temporary access to my credentials for legitimate reasons that are all documented. Renata studied the pages for a long time without saying anything. I did not do this, Jasmine said, quiet, steady, because she'd already said it once in fear and she wanted to say it again in something closer to certainty. But I think I know who did, and I think I can show you why. Renata looked up. If you're wrong about this, you understand what that means for you. I understand exactly what it means, Jasmine said. I'm not wrong. Took 4 days. 4 of the longest days of Jasmine's entire adult life, days spent technically suspended, badge in an envelope in Renata's office, unable to set foot on the floor where her career and, by now, a good part of her heart lived, unable to do anything except wait and take her children to school and lie awake running the same numbers over and over in her head, certain and then uncertain and then certain again. On the 5th day Renata called her back in. Grant was already there when she arrived, standing rather than sitting, arms crossed, jaw set in a way she hadn't seen from him before. The badge logs confirm it, Renata said without preamble. Marcus Feld's credentials were used to remotely access the building's authentication server during the migration window, exactly as you said, and we found a second login attempt using cached credentials from that period, timed 6 minutes before the flagged transaction on Thursday. It wasn't your login at 6:41. It was spoofed to look like yours. He didn't cover his tracks as well as Derek did. He's been in contact with Derek since the termination, Grant added, voice tight. Phone records the investigators pulled show 14 calls between them in the last 6 weeks. We believe Marcus was continuing to route funds through an account Derek originally set up, and when the fraud team started closing in again, he needed someone else to take the fall fast before anyone looked at him. He asked me once what days I picked my son up, Jasmine said quietly. I thought he was just making conversation. He was gathering a window, Renata said. A time you'd have a verifiable alibi that made it look, on paper, like you had motive and opportunity both, and a reason to be distracted enough not to notice. Jasmine sat down slowly in the chair across from Renata's desk, because her legs had gone a little unsteady and she didn't entirely trust them at that moment. So what happens now? Marcus was terminated this morning, Grant said. The company's already coordinating with our fraud counsel about pursuing this criminally, both against him and pending final confirmation against Derek as well. Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately, and it will not appear anywhere in your file. I made sure of that personally. I want it in writing, Jasmine said, not because I don't believe you, but because I never again want to be in a position where somebody's word is the only thing standing between me and losing everything I've built. You'll have it in writing by end of day, Renata said, and for what it's worth, I should have caught the routing similarity myself faster than I did. You did the harder work of proving it while suspended without access without your badge in 4 days. That's not nothing and I won't pretend it is. Jasmine walked out of that office and stood in the hallway for a moment, and it was only there, alone, that the shaking finally caught up with her fully, the delayed kind of shaking that comes after you've held something together long enough for it to actually matter and only afterward realize how close it came to not holding. Grant found her there a minute later. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood next to her, the way you stand next to someone when the moment doesn't need words in it yet. I was so scared, she said finally, quiet, admitting it out loud for the first time. Not of losing the job. Of losing it and having everyone believe I actually did it. Of my kids growing up knowing their mother got fired for fraud, and never being able to fully undo that no matter how much I proved otherwise later. You proved it, Grant said. Completely and fast under conditions that would have broken most people. I need you to actually hear that, not just agree with it because it's polite to agree. I hear it, she said, and for the first time in 4 days she believed it too. 3 months later on a Sunday they were all back at the Blue Plate, the same booth by the window because it hadn't been intentional, it was just the table that happened to be open, and Jasmine noticed it with a specific kind of quiet amusement she didn't share out loud. Odessa sat across from her with a cup of coffee. Nia had her earbuds in with one ear pointedly uncovered, monitoring everything while pretending not to. Malik was managing with limited success, a structurally ambitious slice of pie. And Eli was there, 11 years old, gangly the way 11-year-olds get, explaining some extremely specific point of hockey strategy to Odessa with the total, unshakable confidence of a boy who has never once in his life been underestimated, and Odessa was listening to every word of it with the same full attention she gave to absolutely everyone. Malik had decided within about 4 minutes of meeting Eli that first Sunday months back, that Eli was acceptable, on the grounds that Eli had laughed properly at a story about a fork Malik was extremely proud of. Nia had not yet issued her formal verdict on any of it, which everyone at the table understood by now, was simply how Nia operated and nobody rushed her. Grant sat beside Jasmine, not across from her. The way you sit with someone when you're not performing a conversation for anybody, you're just having one. Your mother likes him, Jasmine said, watching Odessa nod along at something Eli was explaining with great seriousness about penalty shots. Your daughter's grilling him, Grant said. That's just how she decides things. Me by extension. We're connected to the verdict. She'll have a finding by the end of the pie. What are the criteria? I genuinely don't know, Jasmine said. She doesn't share the rubric with anybody. Grant laughed and Jasmine looked around the booth, her children, his son, her mother, chrome napkin dispensers, a Sunday afternoon coming in soft through the diner window, and thought about the last time she'd sat in this exact booth. She thought about $61. 106 applications. An eviction notice folded into fourths in her coat pocket. A sentence that had slipped out of her before she'd meant it to. Nobody sees single moms as wife material. She looked at Grant, who was watching Eli and Odessa with an expression of someone genuinely, quietly amazed by how well something had turned out, and she thought about how the most important things in her life over the past year hadn't arrived the way she'd planned for anything to arrive. They'd arrived sideways. They'd arrived as a man standing up in the booth behind her. They'd arrived as a job offer on the 94th attempt after 105 silences. They'd arrived as an eviction notice that had forced her, finally, to let her mother help her, which had kept a roof over her children's heads long enough for everything else to have a chance to happen at all. They'd arrived as a co-worker's cruelty that had, in the end, cost him his job and cleared her name twice over instead of once. They'd arrived as everything she had once believed was wrong with her life turning out slowly, To be the exact shape of the life she was actually meant to have. "You okay?" Grant asked quietly, catching her looking at nothing in particular. She thought about something he'd said to her once, months back, in a conversation that had started about a compliance report and ended up somewhere neither of them had expected it to go. Some things are worth staying for even when staying is hard. Even when you don't know yet how it ends. "Yeah," she said, and meant it in every sense the word could hold. "I really am." There's a thing her mother always says, has said through the good years and the hard ones, through burying a husband and watching a daughter survive a divorce and a layoff and an eviction notice that never quite became an eviction. Things find their shape in their own time. You can't rush the shape. You just have to keep laying brick until you can finally see it. Jasmine hadn't believed that for a long time. She'd believed in planning, in control, in working hard enough that nothing could ever catch her off guard again. Here is what she knows now. You can believe in planning and still be wrong about what the plan was even for. You can be thorough and careful and work harder than anyone you know and still hit a wall that has nothing to do with your effort or your worth. And then, sometimes when you're tired enough to stop performing fine, sitting in a booth with meringue on your son's ear and a slice of pie you can't really afford, letting the truest, most unguarded thing slip out of your mouth without meaning to, somebody hears it. Not somebody who wants to save you. Not somebody who pities you. Somebody carrying their own grief in the next booth over, who recognizes something true when they hear it and who stands up and gives you back the one sentence you needed most and asks for absolutely nothing in return. That man was Grant Whitfield. Nia issued her verdict at the very end of the pie, with the judicial gravity of a 9-year-old who had taken the entire matter seriously. "Eli's fine," she announced, and that, everyone at the table understood, was as close to a blessing as anybody was going to get. And it was more than enough. Jasmine watched her children and his son share the last bite of pie crust in a booth that smelled like fryer grease and old coffee, and felt something settle inside her chest that wasn't relief exactly, and wasn't happiness exactly, but was something steadier than either of those, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, complete. She didn't mean to say it out loud that first Sunday. But she's glad now that she did. And if you've ever said the truest, most exhausted thing at the bottom of you out loud, thinking nobody was close enough to hear it, somebody might have been. And they might still be standing right there behind you, clearing their throat, working up the nerve to tell you exactly how wrong you were. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Jasmine at that diner booth, or a stranger who stood up when he didn't have to, share it with somebody who's in their hard year right now. The one where the applications keep coming back silent and the coffee maker's broken and they're still, somehow, getting up every single morning anyway. Tell them things find their shape in their own time. Subscribe for more stories about people who don't give up, and let us know in the comments. What's the truest thing you've ever said out loud thinking no one was listening? You might be surprised who was standing right there.